Welcome to Warfront Global. This channel focuses on understanding the deeper forces behind global events, the economic pressures, strategic calculations, and quiet decisions shaping the world. If someone watching has spent years following world affairs or trying to understand how global events influence everyday life, then this channel was created for them. Before the discussion continues, the channel asks for one small favor. If this kind of calm analysis feels useful, please consider subscribing. Think of it as joining a community of thoughtful viewers who prefer understanding events rather than simply reacting to headlines. And there is one more question for everyone watching today. Where in the world are you watching this video from? Is it North America, Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Africa, or somewhere else entirely? Write your country in the comments below. It is always interesting to see how far these conversations travel. To understand why the 4-hour warning matters, the story must begin with something many people rarely think about: energy. Most people encounter energy in small daily moments. They fill their car with fuel, turn on lights in their home, or pay an electricity bill. But behind those simple actions sits one of the largest systems ever built by modern civilization. Oil is pumped from fields deep underground. Tankers transported across oceans. Refineries convert it into fuels used for transportation and industry. Pipelines distribute those fuels to cities, factories, airports, and farms. This enormous system connects nearly every part of the global economy. Because of this, energy is not simply a commodity, it is economic infrastructure. Every truck delivering food depends on fuel, every airplane depends on jet fuel, every factory depends on electricity. When that system operates smoothly, economic growth feels stable and predictable. But when that system is threatened, the consequences move quickly through markets and supply chains. That is why the 4-hour warning captured immediate attention among analysts and policymakers. The warning did not focus on traditional military targets. It focused on energy infrastructure. And that distinction is critical. Military bases influence armies. Energy systems influence economies. When energy infrastructure becomes part of a geopolitical conflict, the consequences travel far beyond the battlefield. Oil traders begin calculating supply risk. Shipping companies evaluate maritime routes. Governments review emergency reserves. Financial markets begin adjusting expectations. Which is why analysts began asking a question that would soon appear across trading desks and government offices. If energy infrastructure becomes the center of the conflict, how resilient is the global economy that depends on it? Once the 4-hour warning began circulating across financial news networks and trading desks, economists quickly moved past the headline itself and focused on a deeper issue: the mathematics of energy markets. Energy markets behave very differently from most other industries. When the price of commodities such as steel, copper, or wheat changes, the impact is usually limited to certain sectors. But energy is different. Oil, natural gas, and electricity are connected to almost every economic activity in the modern world. Because of this, economists often describe energy as the foundation of industrial civilization. Factories cannot operate without electricity. Trucks cannot deliver goods without fuel. Aircraft cannot transport passengers across continents without jet fuel. Even agriculture depends on energy through machinery, fertilizers, and transportation systems. When energy prices rise slowly, economies can adjust. Companies adapt. Consumers change behavior, and markets eventually find a new balance. But when energy prices rise suddenly and dramatically, the adjustment becomes far more difficult. This is why analysts began examining one specific scenario after the 4-hour warning appeared: oil approaching $200 per barrel. At first glance, this may appear to be just a number discussed by traders, but in reality, that number represents a level where energy costs begin affecting almost every part of the global economy. The first impact appears in transportation. Modern supply chains depend heavily on fuel. Trucks move goods between factories, warehouses, and retail stores. Ships carry raw materials across oceans. Aircraft move high-value cargo and passengers between continents. When fuel costs rise sharply, transportation companies face higher operating expenses. Shipping firms increase freight prices. Airlines raise ticket costs. Trucking companies pass additional fuel charges to businesses. Eventually, those costs move down the supply chain. Manufacturers pay more to transport materials. Retail companies pay more to distribute products. Consumers pay higher prices at stores. This process is known as cost transmission, and energy is one of the fastest ways inflation spreads through an economy. But transportation is only one piece of the system. Agriculture is also deeply tied to energy markets. Modern farming relies on diesel-powered machinery such as tractors, harvesters, and irrigation pumps. Fertilizer production depends heavily on natural gas. Crops are transported long distances before reaching consumers. When energy prices rise dramatically, farming becomes more expensive at every stage of production. Planting costs increase, harvesting costs increase, transporting food becomes more expensive. Eventually, those costs appear in grocery stores around the world. For households already managing tight budgets, rising food prices and rising fuel prices can quickly create financial stress. History shows that major energy price shocks often influence political environments as well. When citizens begin paying significantly more for fuel, transportation, and food, governments face increasing pressure to respond. Public debate intensifies. Economic concerns begin shaping political decisions. Central banks face their own difficult choices. Higher energy prices often drive inflation upward. To control inflation, central banks may raise interest rates, but higher interest rates can slow economic growth. This creates a complex balancing challenge for policymakers. Financial markets respond quickly to these signals. Investors begin shifting capital towards sectors that may benefit from rising commodity prices. At the same time, industries heavily dependent on cheap transportation or energy may face declining investor confidence. This is why the 4-hour warning drew such serious attention from analysts. The announcement suggested that energy infrastructure itself might become part of the conflict. And if energy infrastructure becomes the center of the confrontation, the consequences will not remain confined to one region. They will spread through markets, supply chains, and household budgets across the world. Which leads to the next question. Policymakers and investors began quietly asking, if global energy systems face real disruption, how will the international political system respond? As energy analysts continued evaluating the economic consequences of the 4-hour warning, attention gradually moved beyond markets and into the wider geopolitical landscape. Because energy crises rarely remain confined to economics alone, they quickly become matters of global strategy. When the stability of major energy-producing regions is questioned, governments across the world begin assessing how such disruptions could influence their own national interests. Oil and natural gas do not stay within borders. They move through international pipelines, shipping lanes, and trade agreements that connect economies across continents. And one of the most important geographic points in this system is the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway connects the Persian Gulf to the global ocean. Every day, large volumes of oil and liquefied natural gas pass through this corridor on their way to markets in Europe, Asia, and North America. Because of this geography, any threat to regional energy infrastructure immediately raises concerns about the safety of maritime trade routes. Energy importing nations watch these developments carefully. Countries across Europe and Asia rely heavily on stable oil and gas supplies from the Gulf region. Their factories, power stations, and transportation systems depend on continuous deliveries of fuel. If those deliveries are interrupted, the economic consequences can appear quickly. Governments may need to release strategic reserves. Industrial production could slow. Energy costs for households and businesses could rise sharply. At the same time, energy exporting countries face their own strategic calculations. Many of the world's largest oil producers depend heavily on energy revenues to support national budgets and development programs. Stability in export markets is essential for their economic planning. Prolonged regional instability threatens those financial flows. Because of this, diplomatic channels become extremely active during periods of rising tension. Foreign ministers hold urgent discussions. Energy officials analyze contingency plans. Maritime authorities increase monitoring of shipping traffic. These quiet negotiations often take place behind closed doors, away from public attention, but they represent an important effort by governments to prevent localized conflict from expanding into wider economic disruption. Major global powers also begin interpreting the situation through their own strategic lenses. For large energy exporters, shifts in supply patterns can alter market influence. For major energy importers, stability of supply routes becomes a critical concern. This is why global responses to energy crises often involve careful diplomatic balancing. Countries attempt to protect their economic interests while avoiding actions that might escalate tensions further. Observers studying the 4-hour warning began noticing an important pattern. The conversation was no longer centered purely on military operations. Instead, it was increasingly focused on energy security. Energy flows connect economies in ways that make regional conflicts globally significant. A disruption in one area can influence manufacturing output in another, inflation rates in another, and political debates somewhere else entirely. This interconnected system creates both opportunity and vulnerability. Opportunity for nations able to control energy resources. Vulnerability for economies that depend heavily on stable imports. And this realization leads to a deeper strategic question that policymakers and business leaders must consider. If geopolitical competition increasingly revolves around energy systems, how prepared is the global economic network to manage that competition? By the time analysts, policymakers, and financial institutions had fully processed the meaning of the 4-hour warning, a deeper concern began to emerge. The issue was no longer simply about a regional conflict. It was about the vulnerability of the systems that support the modern global economy. For decades, globalization created a network of interconnected supply chains, transportation routes, financial markets, and energy infrastructure. These systems were designed for efficiency and economic growth. They were built to move goods quickly, deliver energy reliably, and keep production running without interruption. But the same efficiency that powers modern economies can also create fragility. When a critical system is disrupted, the consequences travel rapidly through the entire network. Energy infrastructure sits at the center of that network. Oil fields produce crude oil. Refineries convert crude oil into fuels. Tankers transport those fuels across oceans. Pipelines distribute them to cities and industries. Power plants convert energy into electricity used by homes, factories, hospitals, and digital networks. Every stage of the system depends on stability. When stability disappears, the economic chain begins to feel pressure. One of the first sectors to react during geopolitical tension is maritime shipping. Global trade depends heavily on ships transporting raw materials, fuel, and manufactured goods between continents. When conflict threatens important shipping routes, maritime insurers begin reassessing the risk faced by vessels traveling through those regions. Insurance costs rise. Shipping companies must decide whether to continue operating along those routes or temporarily redirect vessels through longer, more expensive paths. Even small disruptions can delay deliveries and increase transportation costs. Another area of vulnerability appears in modern cities. If energy infrastructure becomes unstable, these systems can face serious pressure. While governments maintain emergency planning procedures, sustained disruptions place strain on infrastructure designed primarily for stability rather than prolonged crisis. Financial markets react quickly to these structural risks. Investors monitor geopolitical developments closely because they influence long-term economic expectations. When uncertainty increases, capital often shifts towards sectors considered more resilient during instability. Energy producers, commodity exporters, and strategic industries may attract attention from investors seeking protection against economic volatility. Modern conflicts are no longer limited to traditional military battlefields. They interact with energy networks, supply chains, shipping routes, and financial markets. This creates a strategic environment where economic resilience becomes just as important as military strength. The 4-hour warning therefore represents more than a moment of political tension. It reveals something about the structure of the modern world. Global prosperity depends on a network of systems that operate quietly in the background, rarely noticed until disruption threatens them. Energy infrastructure is one of the most important of those systems. When it functions normally, economic activity continues without interruption. But when instability reaches the foundations of that system, the consequences extend far beyond the region where the conflict begins. Factories slow, transportation costs rise, financial markets adjust expectations, and households begin feeling the effects through rising prices and economic uncertainty. That is why the 4-hour warning attracted so much attention from analysts around the world. Because it forced governments, businesses, and investors to confront a difficult possibility. If energy infrastructure becomes a strategic target in geopolitical competition, how prepared is the global economy to absorb the shock that follows?